We Weave. I'm Alex.
I'm Alara, and this is going to be mostly her show today. I'm just here for decoration.
Something like that. Whereas we're doing a Tarot Tuesday for Alara. Mine is, like we said in a previous video, FUTHARK Friday. So this video will be every other week on Fridays, starting today. And I feel like there's a lot of history behind the runes, and runes were a language, especially the Futhark one, was a language of ancient folks in the northern part of Europe, where we think of Norse, Vikings, where Sweden and all these other countries currently are. We're not really talking about that history side of it, though, because that's a little more mundane and a little
less magical?
A little less magical, and there is some kind of theories as to how the runes came about in a traditional sense of how languages evolve and all that jazz. But the history of the runes literally entails how the runes came into being. So you can't really have one without the other. And for most folks, their mythological beginnings are much more important than how did they happen normally. So this video especially is going to be a little bit about the history, because that's important before we get into what they look like, what they are, what they mean. So the runes, and I'm going to insert some pictures, and my little intro is going to have a little more to their actual depiction. But runes, a lot of people associate with Odin because he is the Allfather, the god that bestowed them on humanity itself. But in my research and stuff I've read, even going back to the very first book of runes I ever bought, which was a little paper book, and it came with runes, there was something a little more important and a little more origin-based than Odin, and those were the Norns. Which, a lot of people think the Norns are just like the class of people, kind of like, if you said, like, Swedes are from Sweden, Americans are from America. People just kind of think Norns are from Norway or something. But the Norns originally were kind of like in Macbeth and some other tales where there was like 3 witches, 3 wise women, 3 entities of some sort.
The Fates, or...
Yeah, actually. So they are the Norse equivalent of the Fates of Greek mythology.
That's cool.
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
There's 3 of them, and they stand for fate. Like, that is what their name entails.
Oh.
So they live in, and I hope I'm pronouncing all these things right. I try to look up good pronunciations, and I was getting all kinds of feedback, so whatever. The tree of the 9 realms, which, if anyone's seen the Marvel movies with Thor and all that, it's mentioned a lot that there's 9 realms, and Midgard, which is actually Mistgard, because the D is the TH sound, not a hard D as in dog. But that was where humans are living, and then Asgard and all these other realms are where gods and other types of creatures live. But Yggdrasil is the world tree, and in its boughs and branches are all the 9 realms.
Yeah, it pays to take in some linguistics classes.
A little bit, yeah.
Because I didn't know about the D with the...
Yeah, that was a hard class, but I had to do it. But it was for Spanish. But I digress. So on that end, the Norns live at the base of the tree, which it's a little weird to explain because the tree is basically, in essence, floating in space. That's not really space, because if you think about it, if Earth and all these other realms are in its branches, where exactly is the tree?
Parallel universe?
Something like that. So there's, again, Marvel does a good visually representation of all these little circles and different types of creatures and people living in all these different realms. But they live at the base, and so there's a lot of theories as to how and why, but Vikings, or not Vikings, but Norse folk back then believed that your fate was constructed at the time of your birth. You weren't really going to escape it. You couldn't really do a lot to change it. You kind of had to just deal with the hand that was dealt you, basically. Is if, you were on a ship and it went under, them's the breaks. That was meant to happen, kind of thing.
So a little less up to free will?
Yeah, for sure. It was a lot more, like, the fates kind of,
Preset
preset stuff.
Okay.
Because I was reading that though a lot of people, were followers of Odin, Loki, Thor, Frigg, Freya, and all these other gods and goddesses, they haven't been able to find actual followers of the Norns themselves.
Oh.
Which I thought was a little strange, because even if I knew I couldn't change my fate, like, anytime I had a good day, I think I'd say thank you. You know what I mean? Like, oh, thank you for giving me a good fate day or something, you know what I mean? Versus, apparently there was a lot of curse my fate in old Viking tales of poetic Eddas and all these things, so it is what it is, I suppose. I'm gonna have to look at my notes a little bit just because the names are a little hard for me to remember and pronounce. So, that's on my other page, sorry. Okay, so there's 3 of them, and they're all ladies. There's one little debate as to some other sources thought that there might have been multiple Norns instead of just the 3, kind of like how there's multiple Valkyries and all this other stuff in the hall itself. But the most of what we've been able to find as far as history and all this other stuff is that there's 3 of them. And I'd actually learned about these 3 in my rune book because there is a rune spread for past, present, future. Oh. And they're named after the 3 Norns. What is your past, cool. What is your present, what is your future? And each one of them kind of had their role to play. And at the bottom of the tree, they lived in a hall, because halls were their important kind of thing back then. And there was a well. That well's going to come up here in a second, though. So the first one is Urd.
Urd?
U-R-D.
Like earn, but with a D instead of an N. Yeah.
So, like I said, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing all this right. It could be Urda or something like that, where I'm not just emphasizing a hard R, or maybe the D is another th, so it's an earth, instead of Urd.
That would be interesting.
So so it could be more of an earth instead of an Urd at the end, because the hard D doesn't seem to really be a thing. Because even for Odin, a lot of times it's pronounced Othin.
Oh.
So even that D in Odin has a little TH thingy on it sometimes, so it's a little wishy-washy on that one. And she was the past, or the, how did they say it? Yeah, so it's just past, but the other thing I was reading is that Earth, whatever, however you say that, is another word for fate itself, because it was just one of those things where there was like a very non-distinct line between the 2 words.
Oh.
I was like, oh, learning new stuff. Okay. Number 2 was Verdandi. Verdandi. And again, that could be Verdandi. That could be literally, I'm not sure if any of the D's are hard or they're all THs. And what seems to have happened with a lot of things, especially in the Poetic Edda, anyone that follows Norse or any kind of old histories, at least kind of heard of it. That's where we first really saw Odin. That's where we first heard of the runes in basically epic poetry. And what they think happened is at one point when they went to transcribe it from one language to another, that th symbol didn't mean anything to anyone speaking English. So they're like, oh, that looks like a D.
Yeah, that's really,
boom.
There's no, there's no equal.
Yeah, because eventually we got the th of TH.
Yeah.
But yeah, so, and there is a rune for TH actually, which is kind of funny, but so a lot of times I think that also happened with Shakespeare or something, where even though it was English, one of the letters threw everyone off and boom, it just didn't go well. And now we just have weird words. But what I liked about hers, so Verdandi is the present, but what I liked, her whole title is what is presently coming into being.
Oh, so it's like what is in play right now, or what is actively happening at the moment.
I just like the whole entirety instead of just the present. It's what is occurring, basically, is what's going on.
Well, because it can also mean not just things are actually right at the moment, but like it's almost like the nearest future is kind of what it translates to my brain, which is interesting.
I just thought it was weird that the first one and the third one didn't have an elongated title as far as I could tell. It was just past, future. There was no And then the last one is Skuld.
Oh, I've heard that one.
Skuld. And again, it could be skulft or something at the end where it's just that th, but that th at the end of a word is a little hard. And so she is what shall be, what is the future going on. And there's been different depictions of how exactly they wrote fate into being. Some folks found art or some kind of evidence that they wove it kind of like, I know Arachne did it for Greek stuff. She could weave things into being in her tapestries. But I don't think their stuff was as much tapestry as it was just cloth. So there might have been less to it. We're not sure.
So less like actual embroidery of a tapestry and more like a weaving of a loom.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe a spinning of a yarn.
Something like that. Mm-hmm. And then, so the Oh, sorry.
Just knocking things over.
Yeah, the second one, which some people are familiar with, is that they would cast lots.
Oh.
So they would cast pieces of wood or stone, basically, almost in essence how somebody used the runes.
Right.
And then whatever came up was like, oh, well, there you go. You know, today this guy's gonna have a shitty day.
I wonder if that's where we get that's my lot in life.
I do believe so, because I did, ironically, my boyfriend was watching a video on how we got the word lottery.
Oh.
And lottery comes from lot, which comes from
Gotcha.
chance, basically. In essence, there's more to it than just chance, but that was one of the kind of the big words, and that's how we got to, like, trying to win it big at the lottery today. Words are interesting. What was I? So lots. And then the third one, which I happen to like the most, honestly, is that they would carve basically your story into Yggdrasil itself.
Oh.
So as people were born, they would basically write their life into the tree itself.
That's kind of cool. And
that's the one I liked the most, so I thought that was kind of neat. Let's see. And then, so that I thought was kind of almost more important than the whole Odin thing. Not that he's not important to the runes. He's the most closely associated figure to the runes because of what he did to get them, and we're going to get into that here in a second. But I thought the Norns weren't really something as talked about as Odin, because, you know, Odin's just a very popular figure in mythology. He was in, like I said, the Marvel movies. They had a very prominent actor play him. He was in all of them up until, you know, spoiler, he passed.
I feel like he's one of the most well-known gods of that particular pantheon, along with Thor and Loki and Freya.
And then looking back, I used to watch the show Gargoyles, the Disney show, and they had a whole segment of Odin.
Oh.
Where
I don't remember that.
Odin's eye was actually one of the mystical objects.
That's cool.
Of the show, and Goliath got possessed by it at one point. And yeah, it was not a good thing. It did not end well, but I mean it ended well, but him with it was not good. And then they did a little bit of that in the sequel Atlantis movie, which wasn't as good, but they did talk about like End of Days and Ragnarok and all this stuff in that, which I thought was kind of neat. So the story of Odin, though, very briefly, it's a long poem. If y'all really want to read more in-depth stuff, I'm probably going to leave some links in this video and then the following videos, just so y'all can do your own research and stuff, just because it's a lot of information, and this video would be very, very long if we did all of it in one go. So what Odin actually ended up doing was he was really big into knowledge. I don't remember, and I was going to talk about it, but he loses one of his eyes for knowledge.
Oh.
I actually forget what it was he was bestowed with knowledge-wise, but that was his sacrifice. I can't remember what it was, but he sacrificed one of his eyes because that piece of knowledge was that important to him.
Oh.
And no one could read the runes because the Norns were their own thing. Again, they wove their fates, and they were at a different power level, if you will, than the gods, because gods, especially in Norse mythology, were not immortal. Like, they went to battle, they died, yada yada. And Norns knew when they were to die, they could write their fate just like any mere mortal. There was no distinction between the two, really. And so Odin could not behold the runes because it was basically too much for any mere creature to behold. So he was like, okay, what do I gotta do? So he kind of just thought this up. He's like, I'm going to sacrifice myself, in essence. So, he hung himself upside down on Yggdrasil. So that's what I'm saying, like, Yggdrasil's kind of like in a weird plane where gods could visit it, but they lived within it.
Yeah,
so
it's actually really interesting. I'm going to just intersect here for a moment. The image of Odin hanging from the god tree is actually one of the things that is most commonly linked to the Hanged Man card in tarot, which some people have. If you're Christian, they see it as like Jesus crucified on the cross. If they're of a pagan persuasion, I have often heard it referred to as Odin hanging from the god tree. But it's kind of that same, like, sacrificing yourself or forcing yourself to remain still for the purpose of gaining enlightenment or to gain a new perspective from something that must happen, that fate is out of your hands.
And kind of tying it into actually some more Christian stuff. Once Odin was upside down, he stabbed himself in the side with a spear.
Really?
And he bled out into the well, basically. So the runes were basically contained in this well of the fates, in essence. And he hung there upside down for 9 days and 9 nights, bleeding into the well. And at the very end, he basically beheld the runes and grasped them within his mind, and he could understand them at that point in time. And then after that, Odin decided to, not sure why, honestly, bestow them onto humanity. And that kind of reminded me a little bit of how Norns wouldn't do that, but where some gods kind of got in trouble, possibly in other pantheons, that kind of reminded me of Prometheus a little bit. Where they bestowed something on humanity and got, in trouble for it. I don't think Odin really, besides sacrificing himself, I don't think he then got into any further issues because he was, the head of his own pantheon. So there was no one was going to, chastise him for it except for the Norns, but the fact that he basically went through a trial and they were, I'm sure if he did that at their home, they were present, so they must have been okay with it at the end of it, because if they weren't, they would have tried to kick him out before then.
Yeah, there are a lot of different pantheons that have either deities or supernatural beings that get reprimanded for bestowing, or have terrible things happen for the act of bestowing knowledge or enlightenment upon humans in either the form of actual knowledge or fire. I think in one of the Native American folklores, it is Coyote, the trickster, that bestows. And then, of course, we have Prometheus. And then there are a couple of other ones, but I find that to be a really interesting topic.
I do, and I just, like I said, Prometheus was the first one to come to mind because I did a lot of Greek stuff in school and then after the fact, so...
Yeah, me too.
So yeah, I was just like, yeah, he sure got his. And then Prometheus was the guy with the liver thing, right?
Yes.
So his punishment, and I thought that was kind of funny because...
Yeah, he gave the first fire to mankind, and in...
retribution.
Yes, in penance, Zeus had him chained to a giant boulder, and every single day, his liver and eyes and other things would get pecked out of him, and then he would have...
They would regrow back.
It would regrow, and it was just a never-ending, which... There were a lot of different...
punishments.
There are a lot of similar punishments in specifically that pantheon, where it was a never-ending punishment, like... Atlas carrying the world on his shoulders, or or rolling
the boulder rolling up the hill. I can't remember who that was,
or Prometheus, but all of these different things. It was kind of a very common. I don't know. It was a very common strain in that particular pantheon.
When I was just thinking of the whole being tied to a rock thing, and then I do believe Hercules did eventually save Prometheus, though. So I was reading about that recently, and I think Prometheus was eventually taken off the rock by hero of legend. So I'm thinking of Hercules.
That sounds familiar. There were so many different heroes that were required to do specific tasks. That's also a very popular strand within that pantheon.
What I thought was neat, and I just thought of this, was Loki at one point ends up tied to a rock.
See, that's
his stuff's not pecked out, but he has a snake dripping poison into his eyes, I believe, and his wife is trying to bring it out, but every time he misses, poison drips into his eyes.
And see, this is the thing. I know that we're on a tangent. We're going to get back to it, but I would love to do maybe not a series, but do some different videos talking about some of the
similarities,
correlations of similar tales within different pantheons. Like, with Christianity, there's the Great Flood, which happens in Gilgamesh, and the Sumerian pantheon.
there's other stories that
and then
mirror each
the
other.
idea of repentance for bestowing, like we were just talking about with Prometheus, and even to some degree, not necessarily with the repentance, but like with the idea of like in Christianity, Satan with the apple, giving knowledge to mankind, causing them to fall.
Mm-hmm.
Similar but not exact strains in like the one that I wanted you to do your thesis on it so bad, the correlation.
Yeah.
I would love to do videos about that, and maybe hopefully that's something I can convince her to do in the future.
Yeah, the paper I did.
To have some correlation of different mythologies and kind of like, breaking out the string, and I was like, okay, but this, and it ties into this, and it's also a part of this. Well, oh, look.
Yeah, no, it gets pretty wild, and then you're kind of like,
oh, this is where my history thing plays.
Yeah,
and I have to like, I'm
nerds.
getting the papers.
we're history nerds, but and it's really wild when you look at things, especially that had nothing to do with each other culturally or even in the same time frame, and they're very, very close, and you're just like, how did this happen? Because the thing she's talking about is I was comparing ancient Mexico to ancient Norse mythologies, and I'm not really going to get into that right now, but their creation stuff, a lot of things were very, very similar, and it was just very weird because I happened to be reading one of my rune books as just a free reading book at the time, so I read it on the bus on the way back and forth from school to our apartment, and I happened to get that prompt in one of my Spanish classes, and I was like, oh. I literally was reading word for word stuff in one book that had, again, crossed the nations, crossed the oceans, different time periods, and they were so similar. It was a little bizarre.
I know, and when she was talking to me about it, because I didn't know about some of this stuff, and at the time, being a history major, my little, my fangirl brain was, I want to know more. There's got to be, maybe it's got to, and I started, hypothesizing and, coming up with, jeez. So, yeah, maybe I can convince her to do some of those videos, but we need to get off this tangent.
Yeah,
Otherwise, I'm never going to...
We'll never get anywhere, right? And, but that, honestly, that was kind of it. The Norns, I thought, were, again, the most important thing to look at history speaking-wise. And like I said, even though we haven't found worshipping aspects to them, because they were just kind of all that is and all that will be, kind of thing, I still feel like maybe they're not deity, but I still feel like that was something that I think I'd at least have a little something.
Yeah.
If I had Norse pantheon as my pantheon, I feel like the Norns, and honestly I might do something for the Norns because I do runes. And then the last thing I kind of wanted to touch on was one of the reasons we decided to do tarot videos and rune videos are because there are some similarities, but they're actually quite different, even though they're both divinatory.
In mindset and how you go about doing things, and just there's so many different correlations, which hopefully at some point when we've talked enough about our own topics, I think we'll have more and more videos where the forks merge and we start having some of these discussions from the two sides of from almost the two sides of the same coin, where it's still a divinatory practice of some kind, but they serve a completely different purpose in some regards and require a completely different mindset in a lot of things. And I think because in both of us, you with runes and me with tarot, that was really the first thing that we both started on before we really branched out into our further down our paths. I think it really helped to shape each of our ways of thinking and the way that we structure things. For sure, yeah, because that was my step in and that was your step in. Because you were definitely doing that way before anything happened. I did tarot 2 or 3 years before I even started down my path. That was my official hard gateway. Yeah, and like I said, I got my rune set in high school, and I
I went to church because of my parents and stuff, but I was like over it by that point. I'm gonna be honest. And but I didn't really have my path until quite recently either. Like if you're talking timeline wise, high school versus not quite 10 years later, but like at least 5 to 6 years later. I mean, that was quite a gap between I found some stuff and then I decided to go further in.
Right.
So, yeah. Did you have any other questions?
It was more like going back with the Norns. I find it very interesting, the concept within this pantheon that it was almost like the fates were higher than the gods. They were above the gods. Like they were their own realm that the gods were beholden to or tied to. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that same idea is very common in other pantheons as well, as the fact that gods were beholden to the idea of destiny or fate. Mm-hmm. So
I didn't remember any of them being tied so closely though.
That's
because
true.
Even within Greek stuff, I feel like they just were like, we do what we want.
It did make me wonder because in other mythology there are tales of gods going to the fates, especially I think within the Greek pantheon, and they bargained, they bartered with the fates. I wonder if there is a similarity with the Norns of the gods going to the Norns to almost like barter.
Mm-hmm. Possibly, but from what I read, and again, a lot of stuff got lost, unfortunately, just because everything else, for whatever reason, a lot of Greek stuff survived. Honestly, I'm not even sure how that really happened.
The Greek stuff?
Yeah. Like, really speaking about it, like, I'm surprised, because most of Europe got swept up with Christianity and all these other religions that kind of buried everything or wrecked everything. You know, I'm gonna bring this up because I was mad, okay? I had to go to church in Arizona because I was visiting my family, and they were talking about how one of the temples or something had been sacked. It wasn't the Library of Alexandria, but it was another temple full of archaic knowledge.
Oh, I know which one you're talking about. I can't remember.
And
which.
The dude on stage was like, "Thank God that happened." And I was like, I almost jumped on stage and wailed on him on the face. I was like, even if you're not that kind of religious, do not be destroying history because we are nothing without it. Like, I was furious. Like, I'm like, and people wonder why I'm mad at church in general.
Well, it's not just church. It's just the idea that those in power are sometimes terrified of knowledge itself because it can bring differing ideas, which can be dangerous to status quo. So, you know, the idea of destroying books, burning books is a very evoking thing. And I think both of us from a knowledge seeker standpoint kind of weep at the idea of things being lost in that way, like the Library of Alexandria. Like, oh my God, that just, as someone that studied ancient history, that just like,
yeah, that blows.
It's like rubbing my soul over, crushed glass.
Yeah, I remember someone, I think it was on Facebook or something like years ago, and they were like, 3 wishes, go. And someone was like, make sure the library didn't get sacked. And I was like, yes!
Somebody's winning at life.
Or like, have it like protected or something. But yeah, we digress.
Yeah.
That was kind of, I do believe that's everything as far as this video goes.
What was the name of the really long epic? Was it just the Tale of Odin?
Oh, it's their Eddas, Eddas, but like I said, and I'm gonna actually link in this video and in following videos probably this YouTuber that I showed you the other day, who he actually talks about the Eddas. I think it's just called Poetic Edda. Because again, they're epic poems, not like, roses are red, violets are blue kind of poems, but like actual stories in poem, like old poem form.
Kind of like the Iliad, the Odyssey, Gilgamesh, think of the
epic
classic
tales.
epics.
Epic tales. But he talks a lot about the actual history. He was talking about how runes were thought to have... Oh, another little quick thing I'm actually going to talk about now that I'm just remembered what I saw. Because he was talking about how runes themselves were probably had their start in Greece and Italy and in mainland southern Europe. And with all the trading and all the ships and all this stuff, they somehow got to northern kind of Norway and all these other countries.
Oh.
And then, you know, they just happen to like these symbols and stuff, and I guess they didn't really have really a concrete alphabet or anything, and they're like, oh, well, this kind of works with what we got going on, and then they did put them into stone tablets and stuff, and that's how a lot of things survived from back then. But, quick thing, and this is going to come up a lot with runes, this is not the place for white supremacists. No. Sorry. Go elsewhere. Bother some other folks. Go die. Like, no. Be gone. Because runes apparently have been used very inappropriately by white supremacists. Like, people that were very, like, yay Hitler supremacists.
Oh. Because
a lot of people don't know this, but Hitler was very into the occult.
Well, yeah.
It's not something very talked about historically. We know because we like history, but it's not something you learn in your World War II class. You learn that it was Germany, and this guy kind of got too much power, got crazy, and then he was off.
Well, either that or you've watched Indiana Jones movies, but you just think that's, you know, just like...
a little something. Or even Hellboy talked about it.
Yeah, so I don't think most people actually think that was an actual historical thing. But
yeah,
yes, he was actually very interested in the occult.
And a lot of people took what they thought of as Norse folks, as Vikings, as Valkyries, and all these other things as the Aryan race, the blonde, the blue-eyed, all this other stuff.
Yeah, I've heard that comparison made.
Yeah, and FYI, the world was a much closer place back then. Vikings and all these other people traded with any other country. They were, yes, at war. Yes, they pillaged just like any other tribal group, because most tribes at that point were pillaging at some point.
Yeah, they're
but they still traded a lot. Like, they traded with, I believe, parts of Africa, like Egypt, like northern Africa especially. They traded with Italy, they traded with Rome, they traded with all these other countries, and sort of like pirates, if they were down a man and you were willing, they brought you on. It didn't matter what you looked like or who you were.
There's been a lot of historical evidence that of whenever they would go off raiding or even through trade, that there would be slaves brought in from very distant parts of the overall continent that would have made its way. So, like, there is some historical evidence of other ethnicities, other
peoples in general.
Peoples, yeah.
And the other thing that a lot of people are like, a lot of people associate Vikings with being very man dominated, and a lot of things were still like, most of the times the dude in charge was, yes, a man, but ladies had a good say back then. Like,
they could be landowners, I believe. And I think similar to a few other societies,
could divorce, too.
They could divorce. And
that was shameful for the dude at that point, not on her.
And I think there was actually... I don't know too much about Viking law. I will state that, but I believe that there was a rather advanced law system. And that it granted ladies a lot more rights,
freedoms,
and freedoms than a great deal of other
kind of
societies at that time.
And then just a little quick kind of in that same vein, where a lot of people think like man is head of household and all that stuff. Back then, especially, the man was really the breadwinner outside of the home. The lady was head of household because she handled their finances. She handled what kind of stores they had for winters and stuff. She handled the animals. She handled the crops if they grew any on their own land. She handled the children, all this other stuff. So it was very dualistic as far as ancient civilization. And a lot of people forget that a lot of ancient civilizations needed that duality, I think.
I'm going to go ahead and say this just because I think it's really cool, and I would like to I would like to offer it to anybody that is interested. But the show Vikings, it may not be 100% historically accurate.
I heard it was really good though.
But it's actually, I've been watching it, and I'm actually rather impressed with the level of historical authenticity that it has compared to other things that I've seen. And it's a very good show. So if anybody is interested in watching that, the show Vikings, it's wonderful.
I've heard nothing but good things, honestly, especially for their Like, I heard the first season was good, a little slow, but then it picked up, and then I heard that, like, it's not as good towards later.
Yeah.
Most shows do that, like
Yeah.
Game of Thrones, anybody? Wait.
I wouldn't know. I only read the books.
I tried. Anyway.
But I've got very few notes from that particular show of this is horribly inaccurate, blah, 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 blah. You know, just within, like, some of the culture based on what we know from historical evidence. So, for anybody that's interested, good show.
But yeah, don't be thinking Viking ladies had it rough. I mean, they did. Everyone had it rough back then, but they held their own.
Yeah. That, and I think there's recently been some historical articles released here more recently within the last few years saying that a larger amount of warriors buried that have been discovered are being discovered more and more as women as we're doing DNA testing on the remains. Because
I don't doubt it.
When they were first discovered, it was before the time of DNA, and they just assumed that man.
Yeah.
And, you know, when you're looking at an actual skeleton, sometimes it's a lot more difficult to identify gender differences in bones.
Especially if certain things weren't left behind.
Especially if sometimes skeletons were recovered partially, you know, without the full. So now with more DNA testing, there's being more articles and evidence being put out into the scholarly realm of being more and more kind of level with male to female on the warriors.
Which kind of makes sense considering Valkyries were so important and they were female warriors. Like, you know.
They were held in high esteem. And then on top of that, you have like shield maidens and things like that. So, you know, the higher levels of closer to the god tier, you have the Valkyries, and then on the more, you know, everyday man level, you have, you know, the shield maidens, which I believe they have, you know, a lot of honors and rights bestowed upon them for their own special brand of, you know, their skills. So things like that. I know we got off onto a big tangent, but this is just like an introductory course to like, some of the culture, some of the...
Yeah, this was just kind of like the very basic background stuff. And I'll leave links. I'll leave some, like, the name of the book I've read.
Yeah.
Some other stuff, but yeah.
In here, I thought I was going to sit here silently and not say anything.
Right? It will be talked about when I get to that rune, but I just did want to, real quick, because we were talking about, you know, race and all this other stuff. Because I was learning my name in runes and stuff, and I was first learning how to write them out and burn them into wood and stuff. And the rune for O, which my last name starts with an O, was apparently a very misused symbol.
Really?
Yeah, which I'm not doubting it because I've read that in books and in things, but I've never actually seen where I've seen that symbol itself, just by itself, used negatively, but yeah. So that's going to be coming up, and that's going to be one of the last videos, unfortunately, because O is one of the very last runes.
Oh.
But, yeah. Still sick. But yeah, hope you enjoyed it, even though we went on all kinds of tangents and history buffs and everything
Sorry,
else.
we're long-winded.
We are long-winded.
Thank you for putting up with us.
I thought this was going to be a lot shorter video.
It started out shorter and then we got off on tangents.
Tangents happen. You know, things happen. Hopefully you learn something new, or at least it piques your interest into learning something else new. But yeah.
So,
catch you in 2 weeks on Friday, and her video is coming up next Tuesday.
So,
hope you enjoyed. Thank you for sitting with us.
Right.
And toodaloo.
Bye.